I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Don Jones, scripting guru and author of Sapien Technology. Don, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on where you're dialing in from or connecting from. Here's what we're going to cover today in our session on Windows PowerShell and Windows Management Instrumentation. We'll talk about briefly what Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMI, what it is, what it does, what it's good for. We're going to look at its security and its configuration, and then we're mainly going to talk about how Windows PowerShell uses WMI. And I would like to extend some thanks to Jeffrey Hicks, who is currently logged in and will be answering questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to type those into the question and answers box, bottom of the page there. And Jeffrey will be taking those throughout the session. And then I'll also be here to pick up some questions when we get to the end of the session. Now before we get started, just so that I can kind of get an idea of where you are, give me an idea of how familiar you are with Windows PowerShell. Is it something you're using a lot? Is it something you've used a little bit? Is it something that you plan to take a good hard look at someday? Or did you think we were going to be talking about VBScript in this session today? Take just a second and click one of those four choices. Looks like we've got someone who decided he thought this was VBScript. Looks like the majority of you have used PowerShell a little bit, and there's another bunch of you who are planning to take a look at it, and a few of you who are in it every day. Glad to see those of you who are in it every day. I think the more familiar you get with PowerShell, the more you will want to be in it every single day. So here's, just so everybody knows, here's our results. Looks like about half of you have used it a little bit, and about another quarter of you or a fifth of you have used it every single day. So looks like we're on the right page. I'm hoping that you do have some familiarity with Windows PowerShell commandlets in order for us to do this. And you should have strong experience administering Windows Server and client operating systems. We're not going to be talking a lot of the background detailed information on managing Windows, but I do assume you know what's going on there. So here's our agenda. We'll start with what WMI is, and I will show you where the WMI core documentation is located on the web. I'm going to assume that as I'm going, you have access to this documentation, since I will show you where it is. And I'm not going to cover a lot of the background properties and things of WMI that you could look up. I'm going to rely on you to look those up when you need them. Then we'll talk about WMI's security and configuration so that you know where that is. And then we'll look at PowerShell's get WMI object commandlet, which is the core way that PowerShell works with WMI. Once PowerShell gets something from WMI, what you've got are results, and I'll show you how to work with those. And I will show you how to write simple WMI queries and use the Windows Management Instrumentation testing tool, which is actually included in Windows. And finally, we will look at a Windows PowerShell script, a very short one, that uses WMI. Now again, just last quick quiz here. Give me an idea if you have used WMI before. And if you have used it before, pick one of these options that tells me where you've used it. That'll help me, if possible, relate the new concepts to things you've already done before. So it hopefully will make a little bit more sense to you. Have you used the command line WMIC utility? Have you used WMI VBScript? Have you been using it in PowerShell already? And if you have used WBEM test, and if you've used it but you can't really remember where you used it, go ahead and pick that option. Looks like we've got a lot of VBScripters here, which is great. You guys are going to find plenty of familiar things, just a few new ways to do things. So let's officially get started now. What is WMI? Well, it stands for Windows Management Instrumentation, and that's exactly what it is. It's a set of instruments you can use to retrieve management information. It's organized into a fairly consistent, not super consistent, but a fairly consistent means of accessing all these different types of management information. It's based on a set of classes, and those classes are organized into a system of namespaces. Typically, a namespace represents a particular Microsoft product, such as Windows or SQL Server or Internet Information Server or even Microsoft Office. Sometimes the namespaces represent small categories of a product. For example, there is a Security Center namespace, which represents the Windows XP and Windows Vista Security Center. The classes live inside the namespaces. The classes actually contain the management information that we want. And these classes are all accessible locally and remotely. In fact, WMI is one of the areas where PowerShell can do remote management because WMI is remotely accessible. So here's sort of a graphic of how this all comes together. We're going to primarily be working in the namespace called root SIMv2, CIMv2. SIM stands for the Common Information Model. This is version 2 of the SIM namespace. Inside that namespace are all the core classes that relate to the Windows operating system. Now, for consistency, these class names typically start with a Win32 underscore. So we've got Win32 underscore logical disk class. Now, the class is just an abstract description of what a logical disk would look like. If you have two logical disks in your system, say C and D, then you have two instances of that class. The first instance, which would have a number of 0, represents your C drive. The second instance would have a number of 1 and represents your D drive, and so forth. So once you've got those instances, you have properties and methods. Properties describe things about it. So if this was a logical disk, I would have properties like the size, the amount of free space, the device ID, and so forth. Methods tell the object to do something. So a method might be to schedule an auto check or to cancel an auto check. So those are sort of the verbs. A method makes it do something. With the operating system class, I have a method that allows me to restart or shut down the computer. So that's how all that works. Now, I do have a good question here in the queue I want to answer, which is if PowerShell will be the main management tool for Longhorn Core since there will be no GUI. That's a great question. I do want to answer that really quickly because it does kind of relate to this WMI stuff. PowerShell will not run on Longhorn Server Core, and that's because PowerShell requires version 2 or version 3 of the .NET framework, and the .NET framework is not available on Server Core. So that's the first version of Server Core. Now, Microsoft has definitely heard loud and clear that we'd like PowerShell to run on Server Core, and they've promised to work on that for a future version. But the first version of Server Core we get will not actually run PowerShell. That doesn't mean you won't be able to do stuff with Server Core using PowerShell. If you run PowerShell on your computer, you will be able to reach out to the WMI that's running on Server Core because Server Core does run WMI, and you'll be able to do some management that way. So really what we're going to be talking about today is one of the big ways that you'll be able to manage Server Core through WMI. So that's what WMI is, and that's sort of how it's organized. Now, the next thing I want to show you is the documentation. And I really can't stress enough. You know, you always hear RTFM, read the manual. The WMI documentation is really important. It contains a ton of information. It's pretty logically laid out. And if you're going to use WMI, and if you want to be effective with it, this documentation is something you should have bookmarked in your web browser. Now, the way you get there is to go to msdn.microsoft.com/library. And what I'm going to show you documents the Win32 classes, and those are in the root SIMP2 namespace. In other words, these are the core classes, again, that relate to the Windows operating system. Other namespaces, I mentioned there was one for Internet Information Server, there's one for Microsoft DNS Server, there's one for Active Directory. Those other namespaces are documented with those other products sometimes. Unfortunately, Microsoft hasn't been great about documenting all of the WMI they've built. So when we start looking at some tools to browse WMI, you're going to see stuff on your computer and get really excited and say, wow, I didn't know there was a WMI way to do that. And you're going to go looking for the documentation that tells you more how to use it, and sometimes you might not find it. And that's unfortunate, but you do what you can. You can always come up to my website at scriptinganswers.com, and I'll give you that URL again later. And we can try and help you out with that in our discussion forums. So I'm going to drop you onto a web page now. This is the front page for the Win32 class reference, and you can see that it's broken down into computer system hardware classes, operating system classes, installed applications, and so forth. If you click, and you'll have to click because at this point this page is going to follow your clicks, not mine. If you click the operating system classes, you'll get taken to the next page, which lists all the categories of the things in the operating system. You can get to processes and operating system settings. I'm going to click on operating system settings, and I'm going to scroll down until I find the Win32 operating system class, Win32 operating system. And I click on that, and this is the actual class documentation page. And you can see that it lists all of the properties and all of the methods that are available. If you scroll down past the property list in the gray box, you'll see that the methods include things like reboot, set date time, shutdown, and so forth. The most important thing I want to show you on this page, though, if you've been following along, is to scroll all the way to the very, very bottom, and you're going to see a table called Requirements. And this table tells you which versions of the Windows operating system support this particular class. Now, if you followed along and went down to Win32 operating system, you'll see that it's available on everything back to Windows NT 4.0. That's not the case with every WMI class. And the reason I wanted to point this out is because there's nothing worse than sitting on, let's say, a Windows 2000 computer or even a Windows Server 2003 machine, banging your head against it, trying to get it to do what you want, when in fact the WMI class you're working with doesn't exist on that version of the operating system. So before you do anything with WMI, make sure that the class you've chosen to work with actually exists on the operating system that you plan to use it on. So you can always come back to this again. If you right-click this page, you can create a shortcut elsewhere on your computer or copy the shortcut. And again, you can get there by going to msdn.microsoft.com/library. The next thing I want to talk about is WMI's security and configuration. WMI has its own security subsystem. All of the WMI namespaces can have different security settings apply. By default, local users can query WMI locally. So if I'm sitting on my computer, even if I'm just a regular user, I can query my own WMI settings. Local administrators can query WMI remotely. So if I'm a local administrator on computer B, I can get to computer B's WMI information from a different machine. And all of this is configured through the WMI control snap-in. So that's a Microsoft Management Console snap-in. And let me show you what that looks like right now. Now there's no default console. By the way, if you want to get a little bit more screen space, you can press Control-H. And Control-H again will bring back all the Chrome from the live meeting interface. There's no default console for this. So you're going to have to open a blank MMC, go to Add Remove Snap-ins on the File menu, and then find the WMI control snap-in and then add it. And the first time I did this, it was a little bit frustrating because I clicked on it and nothing appeared. And I thought, well, this isn't very useful. But it turns out you need to right-click it and select Properties in order for the Properties dialog box to come up. Once you do that, it'll connect to WMI on your machine. And the section we're going to go straight over to is the Security tab. And you can see all the different namespaces here. I've got one for DFS. I've got one for Security Center. I have one for WMI itself. And here's that SIM-v2 namespace we talked about. And you can see that it's even got sub-namespaces, applications, terminal services. So there's all this stuff that we can get to with WMI. Now, again, every different type of computer is going to have different stuff. If I had SQL Server installed, I'd have a namespace for that. If I was doing this on a server machine instead of a Windows Vista computer, then I might have Active Directory or a number of other namespaces. By default, security is only configured on the root namespace. The rest of the namespaces just inherit that. So if I select root and then click the security button, I will pull up the security dialog box here. And you can see that by default, authenticated users do have the ability, see the enable account permission here. Any authenticated user can locally query, and that's what enable account means. You see that authenticated users cannot remote enable though, which means they can't remotely query information. Of all the different accounts here, local service, network service, only local administrators have the ability to remotely query. Now, I do want to caution you that you don't want to go changing the security without thinking very carefully. A lot of different applications rely on this security. For example, Microsoft Systems Management Server collects a lot of its inventory data through WMI. So if you change the security on the repository, you do run the risk of breaking other applications. So be real careful of that. So I'm going to back out of this console now that you've seen where that is and how to get to it. The next thing I want to talk about is actually getting into PowerShell and using the getWMIObject commandlet. So this is how PowerShell does WMI. The commandlet name is getWMIObject. Its alias is gwmi, and you'll see me use that. Most of the time, if you just want to get something off your local computer, you just give it the class name you want, like Win32 operating system or Win32 logical disk. If it's in a different namespace than root SIM-v2, then you need to specify the namespace parameter and tell it what namespace your class is in. If you want to get WMI information from a remote computer, you would use the computer argument and give it the computer name you want to connect to. If the account you used to launch PowerShell is not a local administrator on the remote computer, then you can use the credential parameter. And the easiest way to do that is just to type -credential and give it the domain /username that you want to use to connect to the other computer. You cannot use an alternate credential when you're making a connection to the local WMI. That's just the way WMI is built. It's actually done on purpose. So if you want to use WMI, you need to be making sure locally. You need to make sure you're running PowerShell as an account that can do whatever you want. So here are some brief examples of get WMI object. And again, I'm using the alias here, GWMI, primarily just to save space, but also because I'm a little bit of a lazy typist, and GWMI is a lot faster than typing get WMI object all the time. So GWMI Win32 service will return all of the services running on my local computer. GWMI firewall product namespace security center will connect to the security center namespace and query the firewall product class. So that'll give me information about the firewall product I'm running. GWMI Win32 logical disk -computer server 2 will retrieve all the logical disks from server 2. And the last option, GWMI Win32 operating system -computer server 3 -credential. So now I'm going to connect to server 3. I'm going to use the domain /user account, and I'm going to get the Win32 operating system class. You'll notice that the credential parameter does not give you a way to specify a password, and that is also on purpose. As soon as you use the credential parameter like this, a graphical dialog box will pop up, and you will be prompted for the password. That way there's no way for you to hard code the password into a clear text script. So when you run this, what do you get back? Well, you get lists. You can either run get WMI object to instantly see the results, or you can save those results to a PowerShell variable to work with them later, or you can pipe the results to another commandlet to refine the result set. And that's what we'll take I'll look at a few examples of right now in Windows PowerShell. Let me pull up PowerShell here. Now I'm going to try and type a little bit slow. There is a little bit of an internet lag time between what you're hearing me say and what you're watching me do. So if it seems a little out of sync, it's okay. I'm going to try and go a little bit slow so that it doesn't get too bad. And like I said, the easiest way to do this is get WMI object, and then just type the name of the class you want. I'll say Win32 logical disk. And then I get a list. So I have an A drive, a C drive, a D drive, an F drive, and a G drive. What you're seeing here are just the default properties, sort of a subset of the properties that PowerShell displays. If I wanted to see all of the properties for each of these, and it's a big list, I'm going to repeat that line, pipe my results to format list, and give it a star to tell it I want to see all of the properties in this list format. Now, you might want to jot this down if you're trying to keep up. It's the name of the commandlet is format list, and I'm using a star to tell it all properties because this is going to scroll by really quick and there's going to be a lot of it. So you can see there actually is a lot of information I can get to. I can see the drive type. Drive type 3 is a local fixed disk. It's using the NTFS file system. It has what looks to be a lot of free space. It's the G drive on my system. Quotas are disabled. So there's all this information that you have access to. Now, rather than just letting this scroll by so quickly, remember I said I could assign the results to a variable. So I'm going to create a variable called $drives and set that equal to get WMI object Win32 logical disk. Now, as soon as I run this, it doesn't do anything. It did go out and get the Win32 logical disk, but it didn't display anything. Instead, it put them all into that drives variable. Now, what if I just want to get to the first drive on my system? Well, I type drives, and then in square brackets, the number 0. All of these are 0-based indexes, so the index number for the first drive would be 0. And that comes up with the first drive. If I change that to a 1, then I get the second drive. But I can also work directly with some of the properties. For example, The default properties here don't include the file system. And if you remember when I scrolled back up a little, there is a file system property, which I'll highlight here. There's a file system property that tells me what the file system is. So by typing $drives, giving it an index number, and asking for the file system property, I can see what the file system is for that particular type. Now I also said that you can work with this stuff on the pipeline. And you saw me do that once with the format, but let's do something slightly different. Let's do get WMyObject. This time I'm going to work with services. And if I just hit enter, again, I'm getting a list of all the services. And it's kind of a long list because Windows Vista does have a lot of services running. So as soon as this comes to the end, or if you get bored and you want to stop it midway through, you would just press Control-C, and that would stop it. I want to type that to where object, and I want to say I only want the ones where the state property is equal to running. So get WMyObject is going to get all the services, send those to where object, and it's going to take away all of the ones that do not have a state equal to running. So that'll make my list a little bit shorter. Not a ton shorter, but a little bit shorter. None of the stopped services are being listed now. The next thing, I can continue piping that along. Let's say really all I wanted was to select the name, the process ID, and the start mode. That'll make my list a little bit shorter. And because I have a smaller number of properties, PowerShell will now be able to render this as a table, which is a little bit more convenient for me than the list. So you can continue piping these things down the pipeline to refine the results and do whatever you want, narrow things down, get exactly the subset that you want to. And in the end, if you don't like the format PowerShell chose, then you can specify one of the formatting commandlets, like format list, and you'll get whatever you want. So using these objects, whether you're just getting a direct list, whether you're storing the information in a variable and working with it from there, or whether you're just piping it to other commandlets to further refine the set of objects you've got, really makes this pretty convenient to use. I can connect to a remote computer. Let's get the Win32. Let's see the processes that are running on my other PC. And there they all are. Now that's a list format. I really don't like that. So instead of taking that list format, I'm going to pipe it to format table. And format table will do the best job it can with the number of properties it has to work with. Obviously, I could have used select object to cut down on the number of properties that were being shown, and that would have made the table a little bit easier. I could also configure my PowerShell window to be wider, and that would give the format table command more columns to work with, and so it would be able to fit more information. So you've got a lot of flexibility. You really can do anything you want to with it. I showed you how to work with properties. The next thing I want to show you, let me clear the screen here real quick. I'm going to create a variable called $OS and ask WMI to get the Win32 operating system class. Now in the case of this particular class, I'm only running one operating system, so there's only one instance. So I don't have to refer to an index of a specific instance. Instead, I can just say, you know what, show me the build number. Okay, it's 6000. That tells me it's Windows Vista. What's the Service Pack major version? It's 0. Well, that makes sense. We don't have a Service Pack for Vista out yet, so it's Service Pack 0. And there are also methods. And here's a little trick. If you want to see what one of these WMI classes can do, pipe it to getMember. This is going to be a long list again, but if I scroll up to the top of this list, you can see that I've got a bunch of properties: boot device, build type, country code, whether it's debug, the encryption level, all these other properties. But at the top of the list, there are these methods. I can reboot the machine. I can set the date time. I can execute a shutdown. And these are the same methods we saw when we looked at the WMI documentation a little bit ago. So if I needed some details on what these methods did or how they worked, I could turn to that documentation page and find out. So one thing I could do is set OS equal to get WMI object, Win32 operating system. And this time I'm going to get a remote computer on PC. So now I have the operating system object from that remote computer. So I could tell it to reboot that remote computer. I'm not going to do that because I actually need that computer running, but that's how you can remotely control things like Windows Server Core, for example. By retrieving the WMI object from Windows Server Core, I can sit here at my computer and change management things, review management information, and so forth. Let me hop back out of the shell here. Now, we've already looked a little bit at working with the results that you get back from WMI. So if you save the WMI results into a variable, you can work with them more easily. You can execute methods or examine properties, and you can use that getMember commandlet to see the properties and methods, which are collectively, they're called the members, the properties and methods, of a WMI instance. And so it's kind of a way that you can discover things about WMI without reading the documentation. Then you know to go to the documentation to look up more details about how it works and what it does and so forth. So the next thing we're going to talk about is WMI queries and the WBEM test tool. What I've been doing so far is just retrieving all instances. When I did Win32 service, for example, I got all the services back. Now I piped those to where object, which filtered them down for me. But in order to do that, I had to get them all and then filter them a little bit. But you can get finer control, a little bit more precise results by using the WMI query language, or WQL. The results are filtered at the source, so it executes a little bit more quickly. The way you do this is get WMI object -query, and you give it a WQL query. Now, just a second, and I'm going to get ready to pull that up. We are going to go look at the WBEM test tool, which is the best way to sort of prototype and test your queries. And I'm actually just going to share out my desktop for this because it brings up a whole bunch of other windows and menus and so forth. So here's the WBEM test tool. And the way you would get to that on your Windows system is just do start run WBEM test. It's built right into Windows. First thing I'm going to do, since there's like only one button available to me, is connect to the root sim_v2 namespace. And you can type any namespace in here, but root sim_v2 is the default. If you want to do a remote computer, you would just put the computer name where I've put that period. Period represents the local computer. So I'm going to connect. Now I'm actually connected to WMI, so I can issue a query. And if you've worked with the structured query language and SQL before, this is going to look really familiar to you. I'm going to say select just the build number from Win32 operating system. And after I get finished typing this query, I can click apply, and I get my results back, and I can double click on that instance, and I can see there's the property that I asked for. I'm going to close this back out because I really want to focus on this query language. Let's say I wasn't working with Win32 operating system. Let's say I wanted to get all properties from the Win32 service class where the start name equals local service. I can apply that, and I got no results back. So this is a way for me to test my query. Rather than taking this right into PowerShell, I'm testing it in this nice graphical interface. So I can kind of see that maybe my query is not completely right. I can then go in and modify it. Maybe I'm looking for local system instead, and I'll apply that. And this time I got back some results. So this is now a query that I know does something, and I can look at these results to see if it's the something that I wanted it to do. When I'm finished, I can go back, take this query, copy it to the clipboard, and now I'm going to pull PowerShell back open and say results equals get WMI object -query, and then in quotation marks, I'm just going to paste that query. Now I need to turn these double quotes that I used in the query into single quotes, but when I hit enter, the query runs, and if I take my results and ask them to be formatted as a table, I get all those services. So that's a way that you can provide some finer control, a little bit more granularity to your queries. And if you've been working in VBScript, you're already accustomed to using these WQL queries. And this is a way that you can pull those right out of a VBScript and use them directly in PowerShell without having to really modify them very much. And so that's that side of WMI. And again, the name of that tool is WBEM test, and you would just do start run WBEM test to pull that up. And it's built right into Windows XP and Windows Server 2003 and Windows Vista. So the last thing I want to talk about is WMI in a Windows PowerShell script. What does that look like? So typically the reason you would do a script is just because you want to do something that's a little bit more complicated, or you want to be able to run it again and again and again. And so PowerShell does have a pretty robust scripting language, and you can use it to review and manipulate WMI results. So let's say that you've already seen an example of me getting the Service Pack version from a computer. I want to now retrieve the Service Pack from a bunch of remote computers. And so that's what we're going to do next. We're going to use WMI in a Windows PowerShell script. Okay, so this is my script editor. I've got a little script pre-typed in here. Let me walk through what this does. On line 1, I'm using the getContent commandlet to get the contents of a file called computers.txt. That file is listing one computer name per line, and all of those lines are going into the variable names. On line 2, I'm going to go through each one of those names one at a time for each name in names. So the name variable will represent the current computer name. On line 3, I'm using the getWMIObject commandlet, or its alias, gwmi. I'm retrieving the Win32 operating system class from a remote computer. You can see that I'm using the computer parameter. And I'm giving it the name variable as the name of the computer name to connect to. And I'm storing whatever comes back in the WMI variable. On line 4, I'm simply creating my output, the name of the computer, the build number, and the Service Pack major version. And when I run this at the bottom of the screen, you can see that it successfully connected to the two computers in my file. It showed me the build number. These are both Windows Vista computers. And it showed me that they're both on Service Pack 0. One of the reasons I like to get the build number is because that's the only way I know if the Service Pack version is the latest one or not. Obviously, it's a different Service Pack number I'm looking for on Windows 2000 than it would be on Windows Vista or Windows XP or Windows Server 2003. So just a very, very short example of how a script can use getWMIObject and WMI to retrieve some management information. Now you do have to remember, anything you're doing with WMI is subject to your permissions. So I happen to be running this script as a local administrator, and I'm also a local administrator on the remote computer that I connected to. So since I'm an administrator, I had the ability to retrieve this information remotely. I could also shut the computer down or reboot it if I wanted to. If you don't have permission to get to this information or to do whatever you're trying to do, then WMI won't be able to do it for you. WMI, in other words, is not a way to bypass Windows security. So let's say I wanted to send all of this information to a file instead. I might do something like change write host to be output. So now this is just going to be a variable. And maybe I just want to keep it simple and say name equals whatever, and I can punch in my WMI Service Pack major version. And then if I wanted that to go out to a file, I'd just say output, out file, and I would give it a file name. So there's lots of different ways once you have this information that you can do something with it. And there's a lot of different ways to get things out to a file or out to a printer or out to any other type of output that you might be interested in. So it's been a really quick overview of WMI, and this would be a good time to start putting some questions into the question queue at the bottom of the page if you'd like. WMI does provide a good way to access management information on the local computer as well as on remote computers, and that's a real key for server management. When you're managing a server, you don't want to have to walk into the server room and sit down at the console to do something. WMI is specifically designed to do all that remotely for you. It runs as a background service on all Windows computers since 2000. It can even be installed on NT4. It's organized into a system of classes, which are then organized into namespaces, which are more or less per product. And in PowerShell, you use the getWMIObject commandlet to retrieve class instances. Once you've got those instances, you can do whatever you need to do to work with them. So some next steps. If you're looking to learn some more about Windows PowerShell, whether that's an instructor-led class or some self-paced training, you can go to scriptingtraining.com. That scripting tool you saw me using, that script editor, is called PrimalScript, and there's the URL where you can get to that. If you'd like some help, if you're running into problems, scriptinganswers.com is my website. It's a free website. You can log into the discussion forums and post a question, and we have a pretty good community of folks there who will try to get back to you as quickly as possible. I'm usually in there a couple times a day, and Jeffrey Hicks is usually in there several times a day. We have a book called Windows PowerShell TFM that Jeffrey and I wrote, and you can learn more about that at sapienpress.com/powershell.asp. So go ahead and start putting some questions into the queue. If you could submit those using your Ask button. And I'm going to turn things back over just for a moment so you can do the survey here. And then after the survey, I'll come back and start answering some of your questions.
All right, thanks so much, Don. I'd like to take a quick minute to share some additional resources for the Microsoft Office Live Meeting program. As Don mentioned, we'll begin our final question and answer session in just a minute. Just type in your questions and click Ask, and Don will be answering those questions verbally. And to view a replay of today's live event or to register for upcoming webcasts, please visit microsoft.com/webcast. Now would be a great time to print a copy of today's webcast. Just go up to File and click on Print to PDF. And we will now be providing a survey in just a minute. And by attending this live webcast and submitting the evaluation, you will also be entered to win the Zune Digital Media Player. And we will now get that survey up there. Please follow the links provided in your interface and take a few moments to complete today's webcast evaluation. Your comments are greatly appreciated and very valuable to us. So while you're doing the evaluation, just type in some questions and Don will be answering those for you. And Don, back over to you.
Great. So the first question is, I write an article for Microsoft TechNet magazine, and the question is, per the article in the May '07 TechNet magazine, GetWMObject does not support impersonation the way VBScript does. How does this affect things? It's true that GetWMIObject, the commandlet, does not allow you to specify impersonation levels the way that you can in VBScript. The trick with WMI is that there's really only one impersonation level that works. The 4 different possible impersonation levels are anonymous, which won't work, identify, which won't work, impersonate, which does work and which is the default and is what GetWMIObject uses. And the 4th level is delegate, which works, but it's too much. You're really giving away too much control. So the fact that GetWMIObject doesn't allow you to specify impersonation isn't really a huge deal because it's using the only impersonation level that's actually functional and still provides the necessary level of security. Next question is, why would you use PowerShell over VBScript? You know, I've been an administrator for a long time, and typically my take on why would I use one tool over another tool is which tool will allow me to go home soonest. I find with WMI that I can accomplish a lot of stuff in PowerShell a little bit faster. Now, a lot of that is because I've already taken some time to get to know PowerShell and to sort of teach myself to use it, to get used to the GetWMIObject commandlet, to get used to some of the other commandlets like whereObject and formatTable and selectObject. Now that I've sort of gotten into the groove with Windows PowerShell, I can definitely do a lot of WMI-related stuff faster than I could in VBScript. And faster means that's why I would do it. Being able to do it faster means I get to go home sooner. And that's really all I care about. If you're a huge VBScript fan, you've got a bunch of VBScripts that work, by all means, keep using them. VBScript isn't going anywhere. It's in Windows Server Longhorn. In fact, the main command line tool you use to configure Windows Longhorn Server Core is written in VBScript. So, I mean, even Microsoft is writing stuff in VBScript. There's nothing wrong with it. I think over time, you're going to find PowerShell doing more and more things that VBScript just can't do at all. For example, in my blog today, which is at blog.sapien.com, I put up a little blog about how to make a notification icon in the notification area and how to do a balloon pop-up tooltip from within PowerShell. That's not something you can really do in VBScript. And, you know, I don't know how useful that is to you. I thought it was kind of cool. But as time goes on, there's going to be more and more things you can't do with VBScript that you can do with PowerShell. So that's a reason to start learning PowerShell now. But honestly, I would use PowerShell in a minute if I thought it was the fastest way to do something, and I would use VBScript in a minute if I thought that was the fastest way to do something. So it's just a matter of the right tool for the right job. Is there any way to get the getWMyObject to list its available classes, or do I know of some type of WMI Explorer tool? I know the answer to both of these questions, so let me type it in here. The first thing I'm going to give you is the URL to my free tools page where there is a WMI Explorer tool. The other way, and I'll put this in the same thing, is getWMyObject-list. And you can also specify that with the namespace parameter. So I'm going to post this in the Q&A. If you do getWMyObject-list or -namespace and then namespace and then -list, it will list the classes from that namespace. But you can also go to www.primalscript.com/freetools, and there is a WMI Explorer application. I should note that if you are going to run that application on Windows Vista, you do need to be running it as an administrator. So you need to right-click it, run as administrator, because it does require administrative privileges, and it won't quite respond correctly to Windows Vista's user account control. Can I show an example of querying the state of a service on a remote system and stopping the service if it's running, i.e. the browser service? Yeah, I can show you a little bit of that. It's going to be a little bit tough to type in here, so I'm going to type the beginning of it, and if this is something you're interested in, please drop by scriptinganswers.com and post this in the forums where I can actually post little code snippets. But essentially, you're just going to query. I would do this with a query. Select all from Win32, and since we're talking about services, it would be Win32 service, where the name is equal to browser. And then on a new line, if well, I'm not going to try and type all that in here. There's the basic, and I'll post this in the Q&A. You would then take that, and the service object you get back has a stop method. So you could actually just, whatever instances you get back that match that, execute their stop method. And again, if you repost that on scriptinganswers.com, I'll be happy to show it to you. So how do you use methods on instances from a remote computer when a PS credential was specified? I always get access denied when I try this. There's nothing fancy. I'm not sure why you would get access denied. It could have something to do with the credential you specified. I am usually able to specify a remote credential, get back a WMI instance, and execute methods no problem. Again, if you want to post that question on scriptinganswers.com, it's something that maybe we can talk about in a little bit more detail and get some better examples of what you're doing. And that's something we can walk through. Can you call PowerShell from VB.net much like you would call process.start or a shell command? Yeah, you actually can. If you're writing a VB or a C# application in Visual Studio, you can instantiate PowerShell, and there's a ton of different ways to actually do it depending on exactly what you're trying to accomplish. Again, I hate to keep saying this, just because that's kind of a detailed thing, if you hop on my website in the forums and ask that question, we can kind of narrow down exactly why you want to do that, and I can try and point you to the best way, and then also point you to some examples of it. Can you use PowerShell with HTAs, or is there a better way to display a graphical interface? You cannot use them with HTAs. No HTAs, unfortunately. Instead, you would use the Microsoft.NET Framework WinForms class. And there's not a ton of examples out there on that. In my book, Windows PowerShell TFM, the one I co-wrote with Jeffrey, there's an example of doing that. I believe Bruce Payette in his book PowerShell in Action also had an example. I'm writing a new book that actually has a lot more information on creating a graphical user interface from within PowerShell. And if you're interested in that, go check out my blog at blog.sapien.com. And I recently posted an article. We're looking for people to review some of the chapters from the book. So there's a little survey you can take to express your interest in that. And if that's a chapter in particular that you would be interested in reviewing, the one on using a graphical user interface, you can indicate that in the comments, and we'll be sure to make a note of that. Again, You know what, if you come up with any other questions, I welcome you over to scriptinganswers.com. We've got a good community over there that really tries to get you an accurate answer. We try to be friendly as much as possible. And both Jeffrey and myself, who wrote the book, are in there all the time. So it's probably one of the few places where you can, on a daily basis, interact with the folks who wrote the book. And any questions you've got, please feel free to drop by. Otherwise, thanks very much. Be sure, if you go to scriptinganswers.com and click webcasts in the menu, you can get the webcast schedule. There's another one in May, and there's one coming up in June, where we are going to dig up some more advanced stuff in Windows PowerShell. So let me give you two URLs here, blog.sapien.com and www.scriptinganswers.com. And otherwise, thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here, and hope this was of some use to you.
All right. Thanks again, Don, and thank you everyone for attending. That concludes today's audio portion of this conference. You may now disconnect.